Good afternoon, everybody. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of SPME, and it is my privilege and pleasure to once again welcome you all to this edition of our webinar series, the first actually of the new year that we've done. This afternoon, we have the pleasure and opportunity to talk to Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. Rabbi Hirsch is the senior rabbi at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. He is a world-renowned leader in Jewish affairs and been cited a great deal all over the place. In 2018, the Jerusalem Post named him one of the 50th most influential Jews of the year, and one of the more critical, really, I would say, influential voices for more than 300,000 Jews that recognize his leadership. And so his writing and speaking has been all over the place that I highly recommend. His full bio is in the notice that we sent out. One of the reasons that we invited Rabbi Hirsch to come with us this afternoon is really to tackle and unpack really the role of Zionism within the Reform movement. As many of our frequent listeners know, this has been an ongoing topic about that we've discussed tangentially regarding American Jewish community in Israel, and what is going on in a variety of movements and in progressive circles. Rabbi Hirsch is really a leader within Zionist voices in the Reform movement. I think I would say one of the best leaders that I'm aware of. And to his credit, is also now mentoring younger rabbis about their role of Zionism in Israel in their own pulpits and their own rabbinical training. So something that we should all appreciate and thank him for all the hard work that he's doing. The format will be as such. Those of you who've been with us in the past will know. Rabbi Hirsch will talk for about 30 minutes. Then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. If we do not get to your questions this afternoon, we apologize in advance. Please feel free to email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. But really, without further ado, Rabbi Hirsch, thank you for joining us, and really appreciate your time. And the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf. Thank you to Alex as well, and Mazel Tov on the family Simcha this weekend. And it's good to be with all of you. First of all, I want to thank you for your ongoing efforts fighting BDS in America and abroad. I think that's your tagline. And that was so important even before October 7th. But now your work is more important than ever because of everything you know. But the task that you have, not only to understand what's going on, but to be a force for countering some of the really troubling intellectual developments in our academies of higher learning, to fight back in every way you can, and specifically and especially to help Jewish students and faculty fight back. That's really a particularly acute, important function that you have that is ever more important now in the light of October 7th, and it's not going to diminish. It's going to be increasingly important even when the fighting subsides. October 7th did three things. First of all, like all traumas and crises, number one, it created new moral emergencies for us. The second thing it did, it exposed the moral rot that was already there. In particular in your arenas, in universities, arenas of higher education and academia. And then, of course, it accelerated the moral degradation that has been settling in American academies. And we've seen examples of that as well. And we will see ongoing and intensifying anti-Zionism for sure, spilling over into downright acts of anti-Semitism. So the role and the voice of academics, one of the key arenas where this is taking place, is in the academies, and therefore your role and your voice is now more important than ever, and will be increasingly so as the months and years go by. Asaf asked me to dwell on the connection between Reform Judaism and Zionism, the relationship between Reform and Zionism. You can take everything that I say for the next hour and apply that to liberal Judaism in general. You know, it's more of a, if you're a member of a Reform congregation, then I suppose you're part of Reform Judaism. But what I mean by Reform or liberal Judaism is all of us who are left of the Orthodox spectrum, at least from a Jewish perspective, a non-halachic Jewish perspective. So when I say the Reform movement and Reform Judaism, what I really mean is something much broader than that, to include and absorb all of us on the liberal side of Judaism. Now, if you caught, I don't know if you caught the piece in the New York Times just yesterday in the magazine section. It was a fascinating piece, very, very long piece, ostensibly about Black-Jewish relationships. But really it described the virulent opposition to Zionism in parts of the progressive community, particularly for progressive Black activists, for sure, but also fundamentally with respect to progressive anti-Zionist Jews, and the generation gap between older American Jews and younger American Jews. Although if you read the article, and if you haven't read it yet, I urge you to go online or actually buy it. I read the New York Times online. It was a little weird because the subheadline was, "The Palestinian cause has revived a partnership forged in the civil rights era." And my family was actually part of the partnership between the Black and the Jewish community in the civil rights era. My father was very active and a friend of Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King would have never lent his support to these modern progressive Black activists when it comes to anti-Zionism. To the contrary, he often spoke about how he considered opposition to Israel spilling into anti-Semitism. But the thrust of the article was, we have this now opportunity for a new partnership between the progressive American Jews and progressive Black activists. I don't think so. I think it was fundamentally a warped presentation of the issue itself. But the reason I mention this is because of a key idea expressed by a woman named Ava Bogward. I don't know her, but she's from one of the two really very hard left anti-Zionist progressive Jewish organizations. Her organization is, if not now, the other organization that I'm sure you all know is Jewish Voice for Peace. So the key quote in that article was the following: "A couple of years ago, I saw Fiddler on the Roof," she said, "for the first time since I was 10. And all I could think about was the Nakba." The Nakba being what the Palestinians referred to as their catastrophe from 1947 and 48. And she goes on and she writes, she is quoted as saying, "The Jewish family is expelled by pogroms from their homes, and I was sobbing for the Nakba." Now, just parenthetically, it's important to note that this woman, Borgward, now is an unrelenting anti-Zionist. But she migrated from J Street. She was the former national president of J Street U, the university students. And my point is not really to focus on J Street. I have many friends, many rabbis who are part of the J Street organization and the board and the rabbinic board. But simply to point out that there is often a progression between severe, insistent, consistent criticism on Israel. J Street defined itself as a Zionist organization, but there's a thread between the overarching, all-consuming emphasis on criticism of Israel, even if you define yourself as a Zionist organization, and Israel's very character and nature. That is to say, it happens more than once that somebody who might have started out in a very left-wing Zionist organization like J Street ends up to be a quite aggressive anti-Zionist. But the point I'm making is you're watching Fiddler on the Roof, and all you could think about was the Nakba, not the sufferings of Israelis, not the sufferings of fellow Jews, not the 1,200 Jews. Well, this was before October 7th, but not the the ongoing struggle with Palestinian terrorists firing missiles, the Israeli children who are constantly running to shelters and have all kinds of traumas. You're not thinking of any of that. The men and the women blown up on the streets of Israel and in restaurants and in hospitals and in schools. You're only thinking about the Nakba, and you're sobbing, sobbing, sobbing. Now, the reason I found this to be instructive is it goes to the very heart of how we see Judaism, how we understand the Jewish condition. Does Fiddler on the Roof, and I'm assuming that all of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof, does Fiddler on the Roof only speak about universal dislocation, suffering, and injustice? All I can think about was the Nakba. Or is Fiddler on the Roof also and primarily about Jewish suffering, Jewish injustice, and persecution of Jews? Was the Holocaust primarily about universal suffering? You know, what is it? It contains universal lessons about the character and the nature of man, man's inhumanity to man, as perhaps characterized by the famous Anne Frank statement from the diary, I still believe that people are basically good at heart. Or was it primarily about Jewish suffering and the genocide and the extermination of the Jews? And here's the core issue. What is the best solution portrayed by the story of Fiddler on the Roof? That is the story of Jewish persecution, pogroms, dispossession, murder, mayhem. What is the best solution to the Jewish problem? Now, the two most successful Jewish movements of the past century and a half, in response to modernity, Reform Judaism and Zionism, each answered this question. Reform Judaism proposed, and again, I want to remind you, when I speak about Reform Judaism, I speak not only specifically about the Reform movement, but big swaths of the liberal American Jewish community. 90% of American Jews define themselves as something other than Orthodox. So Reform Judaism proposed the best solution to the Jewish problem, the best solution to the dispossession, the harassment, the persecution of the Jews, the murder of the Jews, is Western Enlightenment, the emancipation of the Jews, the emancipation of the individual Jew, liberalism. And specifically, American liberals thought that America was the best solution to the problem of Fiddler on the Roof, to the Jewish problem, the emancipation of the Jew as promised by Western Enlightenment. Zionism proposed that the best solution is the emancipation of the Jewish people, the nation of the Jews, through self-determination. So with that in mind, I want to make three broad points, and then hopefully we can bring this to some kind of summary and spend the rest of the time questions and answers. First, Reform Jews, liberal Jews in the diaspora are uniquely susceptible to anti-Zionism. Why? Because it's a question of how we understand Judaism. And what we're seeing is the same fissures in the Jewish world that we saw under a different guise and different contemporary developments, but essentially the same thread that we've seen now since the Zionists came on the scene and the Reform Judaism came on the scene, and they each offered different answers to the question of how to solve the Jewish problem. Are we fundamentally of the Jewish people? Is Judaism primarily a civilization, a peoplehood? Are we anchored in Jewish particularism, an identity rooted in Jewish peoplehood, and from there pursue Jewish universal values? Or are we fundamentally Kantian universalists who pray in Hebrew, those of us who pray, and who regard the insistence on Jewish distinctiveness as an embarrassment at best, or at worst, an impediment to, and even a contradiction of, Jewish universal values. 19th century Reform Judaism abandoned the concept of Jewish peoplehood. This was really the true revolutionary part of Reform Judaism, with single-minded conviction that now seems to us kind of a form of messianism. Our movement asserted we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community. That's stated in a document called the Pittsburgh Platform. For those of you who want to take a look at it, it's fascinating read. In retrospect, it was passed, I think, in 1885, and it beautifully states what liberal Judaism was about back then. It was a denial of the peoplehood of Israel. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community. Now, the first Jew to assert this understanding of Judaism was the Apostle Paul. And the Reform Zionist critics of this overwhelming anti-Zionist position in the Reform movement pointed that out. They pointed out that the early Christians were the first to insist on a religious creed divorced from the Jewish nation. And it was that finally led to the irreparable split between the Jewish community and the newly formed Christian communities. 2,000 years later, liberal views voiced similar sentiments. And it would have led to the same marginalization. It would have led to the same split had it been continued in the Reform movement and within liberal Judaism. But because this was the pre-existing understanding in terms of contemporary Enlightenment and Jewish values, because this was the pre-existing understanding of liberal American Jews, 12 years or 11 years before Herzl even proposed a Zionist movement, then naturally, when Zionism came on the scene, Zionism, whose essence, albeit from a secular perspective, from Herzl's perspective, was the centrality of Jewish peoplehood. When Zionism came on the scene a decade later, naturally the Reform movement was going to oppose, because the Reform movement had a pre-existing theological position that said, we are opposed to Jewish peoplehood. We believe that human development and Jewish development have surpassed the need for Jewish particularism. So much so, and those early Reform rabbis who were the heads of the movement proclaimed with even venom, as much venom as today's anti-Zionists. Kaufman Kohler, who was the early 20th century president of the Hebrew Union College, the Reform Rabbinical Seminary, asserted, Zionism is poison, instilled in sugar-coated pills. It is un-Jewish. And a month before the first Zionist Congress in 1897, the founder of North American Reform Judaism, Isaac Mayer Wise, proclaimed, we're perfectly satisfied with our political and social position in America. We want freedom, equality, justice, and equity, and these we possess in such fullness that no country whatsoever could improve on it. All this Zionist agitation on the other side of the ocean does not concern us at all. And that is what you would expect from a movement that rejected Jewish peoplehood, whose answer to the question of how do we solve the fiddler on the roof problem? How do we solve the Jewish problem? You would expect that answer from those who cast their confidence and their full support behind the answer that they gave. Western liberal enlightenment will solve the Jewish problem. That is, after all, what Western enlightenment promises. And I can go on, and I can continue to go on and give you examples of this. It's just nonstop. This was the overwhelming sentiment of the Reform movement until at least a generation later, where that began to thaw. What you scholars might be interested in, I don't know if many of you read the American Jewish Archives, but in the 2021 edition, I found it very interesting. The two greatest Jewish historians of the 20th century, or at least that part of the 20th century, Sailor Baron and Jacob Rader Marcus, both failed to predict the mass slaughter of the Jews in World War II, and both advised European Jewry to stay put, not to escape, because they had this utmost faith in the spirit and the ability of Western Enlightenment to bring these universal values that Judaism so cherishes. And they couldn't imagine that of all the nations, Germany, which was in many respects the peak, Germany, which was in many respects the peak of Western Enlightenment, that they could have, that anything but staying in Germany was the right solution for European Jews. Now, with the benefits of historical hindsight, we can state with high confidence, I think, that the Zionists were more right in their understanding of history than the anti-Zionists, and then in particular the Jewish anti-Zionists. Western Enlightenment ended up devouring and decimating European Jewry, and it did so in the name of Western liberalism, Western Enlightenment. Now, no one could have predicted the dimensions of the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism was rampant. That was the key catalyst of the Zionist movement in the first place, both in America and especially overseas. Pogroms were ripping Jewish communities to shreds in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we here in the West, with the benefit of a higher degree of security for sure than in Western and Eastern Europe especially, we kept on promoting Jewish universalism as to supplant Jewish peoplehood, not as an expression of Jewish peoplehood. But we looked at dispersion and exile as a blessing. And what I realized, I spent 12 years leading the American Reform Movement Zionist arm, ARTSA, and what I realized over time, when I kept on interacting with people who, I wouldn't call them anti-Zionist, but Israel wasn't at the top of their agenda. They didn't really care so much, and they were often harsh critics of Israel, is that this anti-peoplehood, anti-Zionist worldview of liberal Judaism never actually disappeared. It's the default position of liberal Judaism to this day. Now, this place of tension is a good place to be, because we straddle the tension between Jewish universalism and Jewish particularism. Those of us who are liberal, and I define myself as a liberal, and I'm a Reform Rabbi. Between my father and me, we spent 100 years, a full century, serving the Reform movement. And I believe it's a good place to be, to straddle the tension between universalism and particularism. But it requires a clarity of beliefs and convictions that we are constantly at risk of regressing. That is, it requires us to internalize and comprehend that, first and foremost, Judaism is a civilization. Jewish peoplehood speaks the language not only of peace, justice, righteousness, and mercy, universal values, prophetic values, but the language of Jewish solidarity, responsibility, identity, and mutuality. Point number two. We have these buzzwords, these slogans, Tikkun Olam and Klal Yisrael. Tikkun Olam being kind of the central Jewish values that's been emphasized in the Reform movement of the past generation, essentially containing the centrality of universalism in Judaism, and Klal Yisrael, which is a Hebrew phrase that symbolizes Jewish particularism, that expresses Jewish particularity. Now, there always was a tension. I won't go into this in detail. If you want to, in questions and answers, I can. Basically, we could study the Bible for 2 years, and essentially every verse contains the essence of what I'm about to say. That Judaism is both universalism and particularism from the very beginning. Judaism, what we know as Judaism, the story of the Jewish people, begins in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham is selected, and God says to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will give you this land. All statements of Jewish particularism. And nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves through you. So right there we have the essence of Judaism, the way we saw ourselves from that moment on. We were a blend of universal impulses, universal values, concern for the world, tikkun olam, and Jewish particularism. The prophets, which modern day liberals, they like to go on the streets or in the halls of Congress or, in the synagogues and speak dramatically and correctly about Jewish prophetic values, peace, brotherhood, tolerance, taking care of the weak of society, all the values we know and we cherish. And liberals are especially eager to propound these values in Western discourse. But at no time, the Hebrew prophets, every single one of those Hebrew prophets was of the Jewish people, by the Jewish people, and for the Jewish people. They were rooted in Jewish particularism. So just to give you just a couple of examples and again, we can go over this with great detail if you want at some point. So Martin Luther King, apropos Martin Luther King used to spike his speeches constantly over and over again. And many of us love quoting from the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. But we never quote the last words of Amos. In the last chapter of Amos, the whole ideological worldview of Amos, where he says, I will restore my people Israel. They shall rebuild ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. They shall till gardens and eat their fruit. And I will plant them on their soil, never more to be uprooted from the soil I will give them. So it's not enough just simply to quote, let justice roll down as waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, and talk about how that constitutes Judaism. That is true. That is part of prophetic Jewish values. But it's not at the negation of, it's not to the detriment of, to the suppression of the fundamental worldview of Amos, which I always, by the way, I always say to myself whenever I'm about to land at Ben Gurion Airport and I'm looking at the land of Israel from above, they shall rebuild ruined cities and inhabit them, plant their vineyards, drink their wine, till their fruit, and I will never more uproot them from the soil I have given them. Micah, what does God want of you? Only this, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. But nobody ever quotes the other part of what Micah says. God will take you, the Jewish people, back in love. Or the famous verse from Micah, they shall beat swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they know war no more. But also, Micah also says, you shall keep faith with Jacob, loyalty to Abraham as you promised. And again, I can go on, but to save some time, I want to make my third point. Zionism and anti-Zionism. And therefore, knowing that Judaism from the outset was a blend between universalism and particularism, but that this notion that came about as a result of our interaction with Western civilization, Western emancipation, Western enlightenment, that either abandoned Jewish peoplehood, Jewish particularism, or suppressed it, is still with us. But to appreciate that both one without the other compromises Judaism, that both need to exist hand in hand. That's essentially what the Zionists understood. In other words, what Zionism was proposing it wasn't inventing a new philosophy. It was restoring politically, under the conditions of late 19th and 20th century world history, it was restoring politically what was in any case the essence of the Jewish spirit. First, the centrality of the Jewish people. We are a people. Second, a people needs a land. And this is over and over again in the Bible. They always go hand in hand. And that was the debilitation of the Jewish nation in the historical context of late 19th and early 20th century history. And this is what Herzl intuits. Even though He was quite ignorant Jewishly and a completely secular Jew. And it is this that makes him one of the most consequential Jews of all time. Because Herzl writes, and you can look in the Jewish State, he writes this: we are a people, one people. The way I don't read German, so I read it in translation, Herzberg's great book, The Zionist Idea. But to me, it comes across as almost like Herzl is saying it to himself almost as a revelation. We are a people, one people. The Maccabees will rise again. We shall live as free men on our own soil, in our own homes, and peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom. Whatever we attempt for our own benefit will redound mightily and beneficially for the good of all mankind. So Herzl somehow understood and articulated and encapsulated the pillars of Jewish philosophy for modern times. And just look how similar that is to the biblical promise that begins the Jewish story in Exodus. We are a people. Es Chalagoy Gadol. I will make of you one people, a nation. We shall live in freedom on our own soil. We shall be a blessing. And what we do will redound to the good and the benefit of all mankind. So Herzl intuited Judaism better than the liberal American Jews of the 19th and early 20th century, even though he wasn't learned in Judaism. Now, I want to just, I'll finish up here in a couple of minutes. I just want to point out the essential tension that Herzl and his fellows felt. He's sitting in France, in Paris, as a correspondent for an Austrian newspaper, focused on his career, his Enlightenment career, as in journalism and in writing. He was a playwright, he was an author, and he had completely bought into the social contract of the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, fraternity, that the Jews would be treated equally if they embraced the principles of the Enlightenment. He was the poster boy of Jews embracing Western freedoms, Western Enlightenment. And he believed that was the solution to the millennia-old Jewish problem, the fiddler on the roof problem, right? What is the solution? The age of reason, science, logic, political emancipation. That's what Western European Jews cared about, for sure. And it was the Enlightenment, he felt, that was the guarantee to the Jew and the solution to the Jewish problem. And then comes the Dreyfus Affair. You all know about that. And he's sitting and he's watching all of this, and he realizes that the Enlightenment is also not the solution to the Jewish problem. And this causes this combination of deep despair, but the spark of prophetic genius all at the same time in Herzl. He realizes the Enlightenment is not the solution. We're just minding our own business. They won't let us mind our own business. Conversion to Christianity is not the solution. Assimilation is not the solution, because I'm assimilated. And integration under the terms and conditions of the Enlightenment, of the great French Enlightenment thinkers, that too is not available to the Jews. And he realizes, in the aftermath of this vicious anti-Semitism around the Dreyfus Affair, that from the capital of European Enlightenment, equality, fraternity, and egalitarianism, Herzl realizes that nothing works. Everything in Europe had been tried. The Enlightenment, too, was not going to succeed. And therefore, he concludes the only way to solve the Jewish problem, which he considered to be the problem of anti-Semitism, was getting out of the way, because there was no other solution. Integration doesn't work either. And that was supposed to be the central principle of Western liberalism. It must have been shattering for him, because he put all his trust in Western liberalism, the age of reason. Since anti-Semitism is unreasonable, the age of reason would come and solve the problem of anti-Semitism. That failed too. So he writes in The Jewish State, "We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It's not permitted to us. We shall never be left in peace." And that's how he comes to develop his theory of Zionism. Now, he nor anybody else could have predicted the dimensions of the Holocaust. But what makes him a prophetic figure is that he intuits better than everybody else. He intuits that there is something not only about Eastern European anti-Semitism, but Western European anti-Semitism that is lethal, not only to the individual Jew, but to the Jews, the Jewish people. First and foremost, in terms of the Jewish body, physically dangerous to the Jews, because if you put all your trust in Western Enlightenment and science and technology, that very technology can decimate much easier than in the past the Jewish nation. But he also intuits that there's something about the Enlightenment spirit that will corrode the Jewish spirit over time. And so he proposes something that was so revolutionary. And again, this was the second of the great 20th century movements, solutions that were offered to the Jewish problem. The first was Reform Judaism, and generally the liberal solution, which was to put your trust in the Enlightenment. And the second was get out of the way and form Jewish nationalism. And so he creates, one more sentence, Asaf, and then I'm done. He creates this theory that was considered so utterly mad and fantastic that the opponents of Herzl honestly considered him delusional and a form of madness. But it contains really both extreme pessimism and extreme optimism. This is my last word. Extreme pessimism being, we got to get out of the way of this machine of science and technology and European Enlightenment, and how devastating that must have been to him, he who had put all of his faith in that. On the other hand, he writes in his diary, in 50 years, if you will it, we can do this. And that is what happened.
All good. Thank you very much for that. I mean, you've done a tremendous job in dissecting all the issues and capturing the historical narrative and getting to today. Obviously, I'm also pleased that you brought up the Pittsburgh platform. It's something that Alex and I have written about as well, and dissecting all of this. So obviously you've raised many issues and hit a chord, so there are a lot of questions, and people want to hear from you, not from me. But I'm going to start Alex off with the first question, and then we're going to go in the audience with the time that we have, and we'll do our best to get to everything. So Alex, let's take your question.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much. A great tour around important dimensions of Jewish history and world history. A kind of talking about the dialectical answers to the Jewish question, you might say, boiling it down to some of its essence, the universalism versus particularism, different answers from Pauline, the Pauline solution of antiquity, to the Zionist answers of the late 19th and into the 20th century. But there is a third answer that you didn't talk about, and that's the communist answer, to embrace a kind of universalism that is putatively based in the Enlightenment. Which brings me to my question, and I'm just trying to be mindful of time. Why now? Why do we see now such movement, as you indicated from the very beginning, at the very beginning of your talk, from J Street, the kind of liberal solution, the liberal answer to the extreme anti-Zionist positions, as characterized in the New York Times piece that you quote, and where does this come from a Jewish perspective, or in terms of Jewish history? And is this third solution, so-called, part of the explanation, at least, for why we are where we are today, with so many deracinated, to use that famous old term, young Jews with the generational divide moving towards this anti-Zionist stance, based in a conception of the universal, which puts Jewish peoplehood, which explicitly negates Jewish peoplehood, explicitly negates the idea of land in the Jewish people's experience, and paradoxically elevates another people's peoplehood and land tenure at the expense of the Jews. So let me leave that there.
Well, you're asking several complicated questions. First of all, I should say, I am not a scholar and I'm not an academic. I always get intimidated when I need to talk to people who are much more learned than I am. But I do have experiential observations, and I realize that there's big academic discussion about DEI and what we call woke, and part of this anti-Zionism reflects an identity politics that it's connected in some way to a Marxist understanding of the world. I would just, and happy for you to come back at me offline, and teach me about Marxism and so on. But I consider all of that of the left being a negation of either the desirability of nation states, or at the very least, the desirability and the centrality of Jewish peoplehood. That's one of the ironies of, by the way, of those what we call now the classic Reform Jews, classical Reform Judaism of the 19th and early 20th century, the anti-Zionist Reform Judaism. They negated Jewish peoplehood, but they were the most patriotic Americans. They loved America. They felt indebted to America. They were high patriots. In fact, part of their slogan in rejecting the Zionist movement was "America is our Zion." There was a big Jewish population in Charleston at the time. And so they would say, "America is our Zion and Charleston is our Jerusalem." So, but just specifically to answer the question about why now, I'll give you, I'll spec what I see. So I deal with hundreds and probably thousands of Jews over a period of a year. And there is a very clear, stark division between younger Jews and older Jews, even between the generation of parents in their 40s and 50s and their teenage children. And it causes, in many cases, crises of such profundity that parents can't talk to their kids. And we see this all the time. It's part of our interaction with congregants and with people around the city and the country. So part of it is obviously, the experiences of the older generations, those who experienced the Holocaust, those who experienced the post-Holocaust years. The 20th century was saturated with existential threats against the Jewish people, starting in the early 20th century with pogroms in Eastern Europe, then the rise of fascism, the Nazi rise to power, the Holocaust, the creation of the State of Israel, the Six-Day War, the 73 War, to a certain degree, a little less, but still, the fight for Soviet Jewry. That was the 20th century for us. And throughout the 20th century, these were perceived as existential threats against the Jewish people. There have been now 2 generations of American Jews who have been born with no direct experience of any kind of existential threat against Jews. When you think about it, to sit in a quad and to voice anti-Zionist sentiments is much easier than sitting on the border of Gaza and voicing support, voicing whatever view you have. That is, where you sit often determines where you stand on an issue. Okay, and so to a certain degree, the anti-Zionism in the West by Jews is a function of the security that they feel, notwithstanding the rise of anti-Semitism in our country. And it's a kind of privilege in and of itself. It's an expression to a certain degree of privilege. But these Jews have never experienced anything but Jewish security, no existential threat against the Jews. If they know anything about history, they might have read, but it's ancient history. And if anything, Israel is perceived as a regional superpower and a bully. And most of the Israeli governments in their lifetimes have been right-wing or center-right. So, and then you have this huge Jewish illiteracy, which does not teach what I spoke about, neither intellectually or emotionally. Jews who do not feel intellectually connected to the Jewish people. They feel more urgency towards the weak and the oppressed and the poor of the world. And they feel no emotional connection. They sob and sob and sob while watching Fiddler on the Roof and think of the Nakba. They don't think about Israeli children in shelters a mile away from missiles. That's number one, in my view. And number two is, I think, given what I just said, again, in my view, and I came to this late. I only came to this in the last 10 or 15 years, but I think I'm right. This anti-peoplehood position is the default position of Jewish liberalism in the diaspora. When Jews do not feel under existential threat, there is an impulse, an inclination to value the universal over the particular. It's the best I can do, Alex.
So let me just follow up very, very quickly, and we have a ton of questions. So in effect, you're saying that that we're sort of back to the position of the Pittsburgh platform. The terms have been redefined to a new kind of universalism, not Americans of Mosaic persuasion, as the phrase once went, but rather a kind of true globalist, another fraught term, a globalist perspective. But what's the reform movement going to do about that?
Well, when you say we
American Jews.
Yes. So most American
As a whole.
Jews still, okay, and this is brought out by non-empirical experience, okay, and empirical studies as well. Most American Jews still believe in Jewish peoplehood. They still believe that Israel plays a role, an important role, in their American Jewish identity. But the younger you go, the more acute is the tension. And I think that's a reflection of what I've been saying. Now, you know, what do we need to do about it? I think, you know, the situation is obvious. First of all, on a very narrow basis and a temporary basis, with the rise of anti-Semitism, and bear in mind, as bad as anti-Semitism is here in this country, it's nothing like what exists in other parts of the world now or existed in Europe in the past. So, but even now, even with whatever anti-Semitism Jews are perceiving now, which is substantial, I don't want to diminish it. We've been seeing a nonstop train of people marching into our rabbis' offices from October 7th. People who are, for the first time in their lives, are experiencing and contemplating what real anti-Semitism looks like. But what we're seeing on a very localized level, and who knows if it's a permanent thing or not, we're seeing when Jews feel under attack, when Jews feel troubled, anxious, they look for fellow Jews. So we've seen large influxes of people to stuff like Shabbat services and, you know, various other activities, lectures that we have, and so on. And I think that's an indication of what I said before about how, you know, how secure you feel. Where you're sitting determines partially where you stand on various issues. But broadly speaking and long term, I think if the diagnosis of the problem that I suggested is correct, or partially correct even, that there's something inherent in liberalism in the diaspora among Jewish communities that inclines us to emphasize the universal, even at the expense of or at the suppression of Jewish particularism, then I think, what we're seeing is an indictment on a whole generation of Jewish teachers, Jewish institutions, American Jewish institutions. And we have to reverse that. And we have to reverse it on two levels. The things that you guys specialize in. One, intellectual learning. We have to teach better what are the central pillars of Judaism. And two, we have to teach emotionally. We are who we are first and then we go and rationalize why we are who we are. And so that has to be instilled in the younger generations of the American Jewish community. And the verdict is out on that.
Alex, we're going to go to questions. I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to tackle some of the questions in the limited time we have. Let me try. So my friend David Edmond, I know I've had this conversation with David over the years for quite some time. He's been a longtime member of the Reform movement and a local congregation here in Philadelphia. Cites that back in December of 2001, after 9/11. At the time, Rabbi Yaffe made in his in his address that he made it clear that radical Islam is the Nazism of the day, and David has been tracking this kind of address over the years of the kind of looking at Islamism as the new Nazism of today. You've been talking a lot about anti-Semitism, especially post, and I'm adding to this, post October 7th. Are you seeing a grasping of the threat of Islamism as the new Nazism as it pertains to the state of Israel, as it pertains to the threats and the same kind of global aspirations that they have? I mean, you mentioned in your remarks, correctly, how the Jewish community galvanized under Soviet Jewry. In the American Jewish community at large, there's been not always a full understanding of the breadth of the threat of what we're seeing today that led to 9/11, October 7th, and whatnot. So are you seeing a change now as a result of the, I guess I can glean the October 8th Jews who are now marching into your office? Is that...
I don't know the answer to that, Asaf. I'm not sure. Among the Jews we see, remember, it's very hard for anybody to get a grasp over what the Jewish community is and what they believe. We see, we're a self-selecting group. People who join synagogues want to join synagogues. So it stands to reason that they have a higher degree of Jewish identity than those who are not part of the organized Jewish community at all. But so among the people we see, there are two things going on. There is a little bit, I think, of what you just said, a greater appreciation of the threats from anti-liberal, illiberal, anti-Western forces that Israel is on the front line facing. I think there's also a wake-up call with respect to the presumed partners that we were in alliance with over the last generation on a whole host of cultural and social issues that affect domestic politics and domestic policies. And there's a rethinking of that, even to the extent that American Jewish parents, at least, are rethinking whether, even if their kids could get into Harvard or Ivy Leagues, whether that's the best environment for them. So there's a rethinking of the role and the nature and the influence of higher education in general, and specifically the elite universities that American Jews were prepared to sell, their homes for to get their kids in there. But I don't think it's anywhere near an appreciation of what I think you're intimating is realistic and should be their realization, because I can tell you, I just came back from Israel about a month ago. I'm going again in 7 weeks. And by the way, I urge people to, I sent back 16 dispatches, little 10, 12-minute films of people I interviewed there. And I interviewed a lot of survivors of October 7th from the kibbutzim and the moshavim, the villages right there on the border. These were the left of Israeli society. They were the most liberal Israelis you could find in the entire country. So much so that they sustained contact with their Gaza Palestinian neighbors. When they had a medical needs, they would meet them at the gate. They would drive them at their own expense to Israeli hospitals, pay for their medical attention, drive them back, maintain contact with them. They were the Israelis who believed in coexistence. By and large, they believed in a Palestinian state as well. And almost to a person, these Israelis, the most liberal of the liberals, have lost faith in the capacity of their Palestinian neighbors to accept their presence, Jewish presence there, or a Jewish state. They do not believe anymore that a two-state solution is feasible, at least in the horizon that they can contemplate. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they're less liberal than you or I or the most liberal people? I'm a liberal. Does that mean they're less liberal than me? That they don't know what they should know, and we know better than them? That they are overestimating the threat from Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, of which they're on the front line? Is that the lesson, or do they maybe know something because of proximity that we don't know, or don't appreciate enough because we don't feel it in our kishkes enough? It's not our kids who are running to shelters. It's not our kids. It's not our village that was completely decimated in the worst of European pogroms. And so I think, I don't want to overstate the case with respect to the waking up of American Jews or American liberal Jews. I think there is some of that. I don't think it's very deep, and therefore I'm not sure it's long lasting either. And by the way, you see this in the whole Western discussion about a two-state solution. Okay, personally, I've always supported a two-state solution. In theory, I still support a two-state solution in the sense of I don't see any other way to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. But I, along with almost every Israeli and every liberal Israeli you want to interview, believe that the discussion now on a two-state solution just completely misreads what the Israeli sentiment is and what the Palestinian sentiment is. So why this gap? And when most American Jews, of course, as you know, most American Jews vote for the Democratic Party. They vote for Democratic candidates. They, by and large, support a liberal international policy. My guess is, I don't know what the latest surveys showed, but my guess is they would support a two-state solution, even now that Biden and Western European leaders are calling for. It's completely irrelevant for the Israeli political system at this point in time. And so that shows the gap between the two communities.
Thank you. I'm just keeping a sense of time. Are you good on time for a few more minutes?
Yes, I am.
Good. So let me take another question here from David Musher, who's asking, who's obviously a direct lineage from Mordechai Kaplan, and so he's asking, a question about, I guess, whether or not Kaplan accepted the chancellorship at HUC, being an avid Zionist that he was. Would that be, would have changed things as far as, he talked a lot about particularism and universalism. Would have changed, in your mind, the trajectory of where the reform movement went?
Hard to say, right? I mean, you have historians online here, and it's interesting and entertaining to ask what if. So who knows? But in the anti-Zionist atmosphere of the time, I don't think the HUC would have selected a Zionist leader. Now, I'm the rabbi of what's called the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York. It's named after Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was one of those handful of Zionist rabbis who objected to the anti-Zionism of the Reform movement, so much so that he created a competing seminary that he called the Jewish Institute of Religion, which is right next door. It's sold, but it was in the building right next door to our synagogue on West 68th Street. And it wasn't until Jewish Institute of Religion was built on the centrality of Jewish peoplehood and support for Zionism. And there were various attempts to merge the two schools throughout, maybe a little bit in the 30s, but throughout the 40s, and certainly after the war, after World War II, and after the War of Independence, 1948. It was still not possible to do until Stephen Wise died and the previous generation at the HUC died. And in the early 50s, they finally merged. And they created what's now the HUC-JIR, but it wasn't possible in, the 1920s. And so I doubt that somebody like Kaplan could have been, or any Zionist, or Stephen Wise for that matter, who after all did create his own rabbinic seminary. Hard to imagine that he would have been selected as the HUC president of the anti-Zionist, profoundly and proudly anti-Zionist institution of the rabbinic seminary.
Right, thank you. Yeah, and again, historically, it's hard to say. Let me move over to Ann's question. I mean, and let me add to that. I mean, this has been an ongoing question, as far as, this goes to your earlier comments about the hard left and the article that you started with JVP and if not now and whatnot. Is there an understanding to your mind, especially with the circles that you travel in and whatnot, that there actually are Jewish anti-Semites? Is that like an understanding that people have come to that, or that you cannot be? It's always I'm just a critical. I'm an anti-Zionist. I'm not an anti-Semite. That is, I'm not a racist. I'm just a critical thinker or whatnot. Though, as we all know, post October 7th, when people were calling, deaf to Jews, nobody was asking them what persuasion, what political party they belonged to, just whether or not it was deaf to Jews. Is that a challenge that you're seeing today, within the movement, especially within the younger generation?
Well, there's sometimes labels are helpful and they add to our understanding. Sometimes they distract. I don't think, again, I realize a lot of people disagree with me, okay, but I would just say, from just in terms of helpfulness, it's not always helpful to immediately characterize an anti-Zionist as motivated by anti-Semitic sentiments. And that's clearly the case because there are lots of Jews who are anti-Zionists, and they consider themselves and are pious, observant Jews. So that said, it's clear we Jews have, we've over 2,000 years, we've developed the finest instincts to smell out anti-Semitism a mile away, people who hate Jews, okay? And it's clear that many of them are motivated by anti-Jewish sentiments, and that very easily anti-Zionist sentiments spill over into anti-Jewish sentiments. We see this every day in your arena, on campuses. So I'm prepared to leave to the side the question of whether a J Street former university J Street president of the Zionist organization of J Street, as it proclaims itself to be, who is now an anti-Zionist, whether that person has also become, in the years since she was on J Street, an anti-Semite. Okay, I just leave that to the side. Is it helpful? Number one, it can't be prevented because Jews are notoriously, fiercely, intellectually independent. We are always going to have disagreements, profound disagreements, and there are always going to be Jews who in the structure and that I laid out over the last hour, who emphasize universal values at the expense of and at the negation of Jewish particularism. It's not helpful for the rest of us, and I'll give you an example. I'm part of a very senior interfaith group in New York. We've been meeting each other for years, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. After October 7th, our dialogue basically broke down. We couldn't even come up with a statement. We're trying to patch things together, and for the first time, we met and spoke about October 7th. They asked me to give a presentation. I just come back from Israel. And one of my colleagues, who, you know, we've known each other for years, and I can say is friendly and a friend. He says to me, well, how representative is your view? Because I've been out on the street, and some of the organizers of the pro-Palestinian marches are Jews. So how could you say you reflect and you represent the majority of American Jewry? And then he goes on to say, and here's the really troubling part. Then he goes on to say, and what did you expect? Of course, we condemn what happened on October 7th. Islam doesn't, he happened to be a Muslim. Islam doesn't condone any of that. It's against Islam. However, and there's always a however, right? You could never actually just condemn it just because it's wrong. What do you expect? And he gives two examples. He says, what did you expect when the slave owner opens the plantation? Did you not expect the slaves to revolt? So that's how they see what happened on that's the context, that's the broader context that the opponents see on what happened on October 7th. And that's how they view everything that happened after October 7th. It's Israeli oppression that is causing all of this. And that's increasingly how younger Jews who do not have this sense of Jewish peoplehood are seeing the problem. And they're out on the streets, and they really are part of the organizers of the anti-Israel marches. And it is a problem. Now, what we can do about it, I mean, it goes back to what I said. First of all, we have to state our perspective very clearly, especially rabbis, by the way, because number one, we have a platform, but number two, we are looked to express what we believe to be Jewish values. And if people disagree, people disagree. But secondly, we have to push back. And in the long term, as I said, we have to educate the next generation coming up differently.
Great. Let me ask one more question. I know, we've gone over time, but if you don't mind, I'll take one more. So apropos your last comment. So what are you seeing, in the younger generation, especially in the Jewish day schools, sponsored by the Reform Movement and others, and other day schools in general, to really tackle exactly that last point that you're saying? I mean, obviously, we know, and we've been arguing this for quite some time, that by the time they get to the college campuses, it's too late. They need to know the story before that. They need to hear it, warts and all. They need to know the facts to be able to combat that. Are you seeing a shift now as a result of the fact that, Jewish day schools have been very keen about doing a lot of tikkun olam, a lot of pluralism and whatnot? Doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with the reality that they will be facing outside and the actual facts on the ground that you so correctly articulated as far as what's going on in Israel versus what is being discussed in the American Jewish community, part of these schisms that we're seeing.
Yes. Remember, the teachers in these Jewish day schools and the religious schools, the supplemental schools, and in the synagogues, they're not the generation of whatever they're called, the Gen X or Gen Z, or, the kids in school now, or the kids in university. So they are concerned, and they will, there's been an increased awareness, I think, of understanding the balance, the exquisite balance that is one of Judaism's main contributions to Western thought, the balance between universalism and particularism. I think there's a greater understanding. There's a greater understanding that Tikkun Olam cannot be everything about Judaism. It was bad teaching on our part, and there have to be corrective measures. But more broadly, I think that at least in the short term, the liberal American Jewry, and I say all of us, and those who are on the call who regard themselves as liberals, we're in real crisis now. Because when we look at the silence of feminist organizations on sexual violations against Israelis, contrary to everything about the Me Too movement, that women should be assumed to be believed, and that their whole raison d'etre is to protect the dignity and the well-being of women. When we see the international legal structure being manipulated, hauling of all things Israel into court under the accusation of genocide, you can say a lot of things. You can say, this was excessive, this was disproportional, but genocide, that's the issue on the table for the ICJ. It thrusts liberal American Jewry into a real crisis of faith, not only with respect to these organizations whom we invested in and who we support and who are our allies and all of that. I referred to that earlier. But also about it, we are forced to ask ourselves, is there something in the very nature of Western liberalism as we understand it now that is detrimental to Jewish interests and to Jewish values? Up until October 7th, we felt, and some of us were speaking for years about the illiberalism of what's called progressivism today in America. Okay, but my opposition to some of the DEI and the identity politics that we're seeing based on race or identity, group identity, is that it's illiberal. It's not liberal. Liberals judge people not by the color of their skin or their group identity, but by the content of their character. That's the classic statement of liberalism articulated by Martin Luther King. And this group identity casts judgment on people based on not on their merit, but on our group affiliation. So we were opposed to this, and I've been saying this for several years now, because it's illiberal in our minds. It's not liberalism, but there's something. This is forcing American Jews to ask whether the same question that, in effect, Herzl asked: is there something about liberalism as understood and defined today that is contrary to the interests and the well-being and the values of Judaism and American Jews? Because once you begin to characterize people not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin or by their group affiliation or by their zip code or however you want to do it, Jews are always going to be on the wrong side of that equation. Sooner or later, Jews are going to find themselves on the wrong side, the anti-human rights side, the anti-liberal side, the oppressive side, the anti-racial equality side. And so it's forcing us to ask the deepest questions. We who have done so well in this country because we believed that in so many respects, Judaism and American liberalism overlapped. It's now brought us at a crossroads, and that's the question that's going to preoccupy us in the months and years ahead, I think.
Right. I want to thank you. I know we went over time. I know there are a lot more questions to ask, but I want to be conscious of your time and everybody else. But really, thank you for all you do. Obviously, thank you for standing up for these issues. These are not simple issues, and these are the issues of the day. And it's wonderful to see you, obviously, being able to use your platform and talk about these issues and unpack them, given the fact that I too agree with you that these are the issues that are going to dictate where we're going forward in the next months and next years, especially post October 7th. And all of this is fertile ground in the spaces that many of us live in as far as the campuses. But we got to do a much better job before they get to the campuses to make sure that they have the whereabout and the knowledge to know what's actually happening on the ground to combat all the biases that we all see all around.
Listen, it's been a pleasure, and I want to thank you and your group. And if I can leave you with one message: support the Jewish students on campus. Give them your support.
We're doing 100%, and I also add to that point, and also our professors. I mean, it's not, part of what we do is because both groups who combine the makeup of the campus community are isolated as a result of the environment we're facing, and that's exactly what we were created to do and are trying to do. So I thank you all around, and I thank everybody who joined us this afternoon as well. Please be on the lookout for future webinars. Rabbi Hirsch, really, your voice is a critical and important one, and we hope that we can do more together. And I look forward to getting together soon.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.